All right, our next speaker is Wendell Cox, who's the principal of Demographia, an international public policy consulting firm in St. Louis. He also serves as visiting professor in Paris at CNAM. Blessedly, I will not try and get all of the parts of that right. But anyway, it's the largest university in France, and he has been appointed to transit boards. He is an expert in this field, and his full biography is in your backup. And without further ado, Mr. Wendell Cox.
Thank you, Ed. It's a great pleasure to be here as usual. I'm going to talk to you about aspiration. I'm going to talk to you about the future of the standard of living and the situation of poverty in this country, and it has to do with land use. I start out with a picture of a shopping center in Manaus, Brazil, which is as remote as you can get in a major city in the Western Hemisphere, only to sort of indicate to you the sort of universal interest in getting ahead and why people move to cities. Now, why do cities exist? We'll start very, very simply with respect to philosophy. Cities exist, as Alain Berthaud of the World Bank said, large labor markets are the only reason for the existence of large cities. Cities are economic entities. They are where you go to address or to seek better aspirations. This is based upon a paper I was invited to do by a European leftist organization last year. They thought that it'd be interesting to see what the other side had to say. I called it Toward More Prosperous Cities, and in it I basically argued that the principal priority of government is economic. It is improving the economic well-being of people at the domestic level once you get beyond national security. This means a better standard of living and less poverty. We have a situation where urban policy is incredibly misplaced with respect to its priority. The big problem is urban containment policy. These policies that draw lines around cities or make it impossible to develop in the agricultural zone of Montgomery County. We've got all sorts of situations like that around the world and around the country. It is imperative to stop the spread. This goes by names like smart growth, growth management, smart, compact cities, and also I like to think of it in terms of some of the discussion that's going on now, including an article this week in Barron's asking why the U.S. economic growth situation is slowing to a crawl. And I'm saying, and it has nothing to do with the issues we're talking about here, I'm saying a future in which our growth in this country may be at only 1/2 the post-war rate, combined with what urban containment policy has already done in California, has done in Australia, has done in Vancouver, is a very grim situation for the future. Now let's think about cities. You know, cities, we need to understand, cities are not something that is old. Cities, major cities, there was only one city of more than 1 million people in 1800. There were a few back and forth before that time, but they all waxed and waned and fell down below that level. We now have 450 cities in the world of more than 1 million. Why did that happen? Technological advance, movement of people out of rural areas to urban areas. It's all about aspiration. And it's important as we think about cities to recognize the role of cities with respect to economics. Think about places like Manila. This is a picture of a slum along the riverside in Manila. You know, people have moved away from rural areas to cities to do better. You drive around Sao Paulo, for example, in Brazil, and you see shanty towns on hills all over the place, and you wonder, why do these people live in this circumstance? And the reason is, it's a whole lot better than where they came from. So if you look at what's gone on historically with respect to GDP, gross domestic product, economic growth, you find that until 1800, really there wasn't very much economic growth in the world. The record with respect to GDP per capita, according to OECD economist Addis Madison, was about $3,100 on an annual basis in 2010 dollars in 1800. Now look what happened, and look at the connection with transport technology. Back in the days of walking before mass transit, we had not much progress. Big progress during the years that mass transit was the dominant emergent mode, and then now, of course, the automobile. It's important for us to also understand the importance of policy with respect to economic growth. This chart shows you in constant dollars the increase in GDP per capita from 1900 to 2010. You can see the U.S. does very well. Germany and Japan do pretty well. You see the dotted line there, that's Argentina. In Argentina, they decided they sort of take a new route back around 1945 after having been among the top 10 nations in the world. And to this day, they continue to struggle and make little progress. So policies matter. Around the world, poverty is pervasive. This is a picture from Dhaka, Bangladesh. We're looking here at shanty towns of 2 million people per square mile. Now, 2 million people per square mile compares to 4,000 people per square mile in the Washington, D.C. Urban area. And so think about how cities grow, because this is very, very important. There's this view that says, oh, you know, we can sort of draw a line and cities will grow and there'll be no problem. And it's sort of like, you know, eventually I'd have to get a new belt. But unfortunately, urban planners don't understand this, and we'll get into that. There is a view that says that urban sprawl, urban expansion is an American phenomenon, that it doesn't really happen anywhere else. Well, I can tell you it happens everywhere. Take sub-Saharan Africa. This is Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, in 1972 compared to 2010, the red being 1972. You can go essentially to any city in the world and see basically the same phenomenon. Go to Jakarta. Now, most people don't understand it. Jakarta is now the second largest urban area in the world, nearing 30 million people. Here's what's happened with respect to population growth. The core of Jakarta, the old federal or capital district, little population growth in the last 20 years. Suburbs and exurbs, almost all of the growth. You go to Mumbai in India, very poor place with obviously some pretty rich people. You see the same thing. Inner Mumbai is actually losing population. Outer Mumbai was gaining population, and now the growth is all in the suburbs. And in fact, at New Geography, we did an analysis of the world megacities, the 28 world megacities, a little bit earlier this year, and looked at fairly recent population trends. Every single one of them, the periphery is growing faster than the core. Now, this is not to say that the periphery or the suburbs are better than the core. This is only to say that this is the natural way that cities grow, and if you interfere with that, you're liable to create some consequences. There's been this myth around the country that we have, oh, this great move to the city. If you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and and sometimes even the Wall Street Journal, you get the impression that everybody is moving to the cities. Well, in fact, not quite so. Within 2 miles of city centers, things are working pretty well, and I'm pleased to see finally a turnaround in population close to the city cores. But you get outside that 2-mile radius, you have a drop, and you can see here is this is the overall metropolitan area is more than 1 million people in 2010. You see that virtually all of the growth is 5 to 10 miles, and the biggest is 20 miles outside the area from City Hall. So now let's talk about urban containment policy, drawing lines around cities, limiting to where development can take place. And I'm not talking about developing on environmentally sensitive land. I'm talking about developing on good developable land. This is a picture of the slum on the edge of Mumbai Airport. It's really great. You can pretty much walk across the roofs of the houses because they don't have any streets. Here's what urban growth boundaries do. This is about 6 miles from where I grew up in Washington County, Oregon, where tax records in 2010, I think it was, indicated that the assessed valuation of land inside the urban growth boundary, which at this point is on West Union Road, $180,000 per acre. Comparable land of 5 acres or more on the other side was 16. You can bet that this increases the cost of housing very significantly. Now, there is this view that basically we got to get people out of cars and into transit. And transit does a really good job in getting people to downtown. 75% of the people who work south of 59th Street in New York are on transit. About 40% of the people who work in downtown Washington are on transit. But we have to understand that transit is about downtown. Now, Statistics Canada basically did some research and said, let's look at the travel patterns of people that live in high-density developments more than 10 kilometers or 6 miles from downtown. And what they found is there's virtually no difference. Density does not create transit ridership. And you put high-rise buildings in the suburbs. Ballston will work if you got right there next to a really good subway station, but that's not enough. You You cannot basically change the travel patterns of people that far from the core. There are some concerns about preserving agricultural land and urbanization destroying agricultural land. Since 1950, we've doubled the production of agriculture in this country. We have taken out of production an area of land equal to the size of the states of California, Texas, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And that's because we didn't need the land. So the point is, agricultural production is hardly a problem. Talk about housing affordability. First of all, the big reason housing affordability counts, and it's the key to the whole discussion, is that housing is by far the largest element of household expenditure. Economists are, in consensus that if you limit the supply of a good in demand, you are going to raise prices. And this is exactly what has happened with respect to house prices and urban containment. Don Brash was the governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and in fact I should mention David Seymour here from Canada was actually a part of Mr. Brash's parliamentary election campaign a few years ago in New Zealand. They lost, but still a really good guy. Brash basically said the affordability of housing is overwhelmingly a function of just one thing, the extent to which governments place artificial restrictions on the supply of residential land. We do an annual housing affordability survey. Last year was our 9th year. Bill English, the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, gave us the introduction, and he basically outlined the programs that they have undertaken in order to basically close the door on smart growth in New Zealand, where it's ruined housing affordability, just like has already happened with Governor Scott in Florida. We use in looking at housing affordability, we use the median multiple, which is the median house price divided by the median household income. That has been historically around 3. You can see in the late 1980s, it was 3 in the 6 countries that we cover in our survey. You can see what's happened to Australia, where housing affordability has absolutely been destroyed. Ireland went up the same way, New Zealand, the UK, Canada has been going up, and the US went up and now has gone down. But of course, as we all know, as a lot of us know, in the United States, the housing bubble was really a 4-state thing for the most part. It had to do with California, Nevada, Arizona, and Florida, and it had to do with land use restrictions. And if you look at Texas and Georgia and the Midwest, you find, yes, there was some inflation of house prices relative to incomes, but not much. And here you see the impact out of the housing affordability since 1950 by current land use classification. The top line is California. You can still see that overall the California average is about double that of the states that have regular, traditional, liberal land use regulation. The second line is states like Oregon and Maryland and so on that have restrictive regulation but have not had quite as bad a regulatory situation as California. Now, one of the big concerns, and a rightful concern, that the smart growth conservative community has with respect to housing affordability is the impact on low-income people. You can read the literature, and you will find this is a real concern on the part of smart growth advocates. And in fact, they have gone so far that the principal research that continues to be cited to this day talks about how this should improve housing affordability for low-income people. Should doesn't do it. Here's what's happened in Portland. You look at house prices that in the high poverty areas since from 99 to 2009, in the high poverty areas of the Portland metropolitan area, you can see that the house prices went up far higher in the poverty areas than it did in the lower, in the areas where the incomes were more normal. Sorry, I got lost my glasses here. 61% rise in the high poverty areas, and in the other areas 35. But even worse was the comparative increase in gross rents. 3 times as high an increase in gross rents in high poverty areas as in areas with normal income. So let me tell you, smart growth and urban containment may be bad on the middle class. It's really bad for the poor. So we look at the consequences of urban containment, and this is the real, I see a spelling error there. Randall, was that your fault? Oh, it's the Macintosh. Yeah, okay. And anyway, the big problem here is that by smart growth and urban containment policy, we are driving house prices up. We are making it more difficult for young people and people who buy houses to be able to afford to live a decent lifestyle. In the long run, the standard of living or the quality of life is defined by discretionary income, which is the total income minus taxes and minus the cost of necessity. Paul Cheshire, an economist at the London School of Economics, has said that urban containment is incompatible with housing affordability. Professor Edwin Mills and an associate at Northwestern have basically gone so far as to suggest that the housing bust could pretty much be blamed on the problems of urban containment policy, land use policy. The basic idea being that if we had not had the huge increases in the 4 states, for example, and there were some other places, including D.C., if the restrictions had not been in place there, the house prices would not have gone up as much, and maybe the losses would have been sustainable. But it's bigger than that. We have a growing body of research that suggests that overall economies are hurt substantially by urban containment policy. We have research out of the United Kingdom that talks about higher commercial development costs. We have research out of the Netherlands that talks about lower general economic and employment levels as a result of urban containment policy. We have Federal Reserve Board economist research here that says job growth is less where there is urban containment policy or more restrictive land use policy, and research that says generally that unemployment has been higher in the UK because of urban containment policy. So let's talk just a little bit about cities and transportation. This is one of my favorite pictures. It is the second largest road I've ever driven on. Here it's 16 lanes in Buenos Aires. It gets to 18 at one point. But here we have a really great picture of the GO Transit system in Toronto. That's the Don Valley Parkway on the east side of the downtown area of Toronto. And it really is a very effective system. It does a great job. Why do you think, however, that all those people are in those cars? Seems very strange. Well, I finally figured it out. The train isn't going where those cars are going. And that's the big problem people don't understand with respect to transit. You know, if you work in downtown Washington or Manhattan or downtown San Francisco, you can't beat transit, and I would argue that anybody that doesn't really need the car at the office during the day is irrational if they're not on transit. And when I lived in Paris, you can bet that I either walked or I took metro to work. Wouldn't have thought of even renting a car except to drive someplace out of town. Research at the Brookings Institution says that in terms of how many jobs in the metropolitan areas, major metropolitan areas, the average person can get to in 45 minutes on transit. Now, 45 minutes, remind you, is almost double the 25.5 minutes that Alan Pisarski was talking about this morning. The average is about 6%. In New York, it's about 10%. Now, transit is great, but transit is about town. And there's no way we're going to get people to ride transit if it is inconvenient. And by the way, when I first brought this out a few years ago, there were those who were so crazy as to suggest, well, we need more transit. Well, just how are you going to afford it? And by the way, this basically suggests an interesting thing. With the mobility being so bad, and I don't argue with transit, transit does exactly what it should do. The last thing we need is for transit to reallocate its service and start sending buses and trains all over the place where they don't carry anybody. Does a real good job of getting people downtown. Interestingly, the dark green line is the share of workers at income levels that get to work by car. And you can see even in the lowest income levels, the great majority of people get to work by car. In fact, there's plenty of research out there about how better mobility improves the economic performance of cities. That's why we need to deal with the congestion problem, because, as Remy Prudhomme said, his research at University of Paris, Hartgen at University of North Carolina working for Reason, Bob Severo at the University of California, the more jobs an employee can get to a certain amount of time, like 30 minutes, The more economically efficient a city is going to be, the better will be the employment situation. So that's why we need to get the traffic moving. Real important. And by the way, a lot of people have this sense that with all of our terrible, sprawling cities in the United States, that we're spending all this extra time getting to work. Well, as a matter of fact, for the most part, the United States has the best work trip travel times in the world. This is from research that I've done and was published by the Singapore Land Transport Authority. You can see the average work trip travel time we used, I think, 2008, slightly below 25 minutes. Western Europe was a little bit above it. Canada, surprisingly more, but Canada, again, is more dense, and that is really what's driving it. Density is what's driving it. Australia, believe it or not, which you would think would at least be as good as Canada, not even close. And then you get East Asia, where you're up almost at 40 minutes. So, you know, for any of you that think that Hong Kong is the model, you know, 65,000 people per square mile, smart growth dream. Urban containment dream. 46 minutes each way to work. And I was talking to some people at a conference I was at in Dallas a couple of weeks ago who live in Hong Kong, and I said, well, you know, how long do you usually have to stand in line down there in Central to get on those buses? I mean, you can't believe the lines down there. And I'll bet that, and I was told, no, not more than half an hour usually. I suspect that the Hong Kong data I haven't been able to figure out does not include the waiting time there. Now let's talk a little bit about sustainability, because that's the trump card. The other side always likes to say, oh, we got to do all this thing because we got to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not arguing with that goal, not at all. Let's look at the record. First of all, if we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we need to do it effectively, cost effectively. The IPCC says the number is $20 to $50. $20 to $50. You can look at all sorts of planning literature in the United States, and you'll find few examples of situations where the transit cost where the cost of getting somebody out of a car onto transit is less than $1,000 per ton. If you want to look at the housing impacts, it's way off the charts. So the basic point is, you cannot get from here to there with urban containment policy. It is unnecessary, it is excessively expensive, and it will destroy economies, destroy lives, and destroy household budgets. Here's what's going on, and Tom talked about this. The current the current Energy Department projections with respect to the Obama 54.5 mile per gallon standard, we're going to see driving go up from 2010 to 2040 by about 40%, and we're going to see greenhouse gas emissions go down about 25. Now, by the way, that assumes no improvement on fuel efficiency after 2025, and I suspect that we'll see that coming as well. And so we have a situation where if you look at the best reports on urban containment and what can be accomplished by that with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, and you eliminate the crazy figures, things like moving cooler, which Alan Pisarski has shown made no sense at all, and you say, okay, well, let's only look at the conservative projections. You look at the TRB report called Driving Cooler, where the drafting committee could not agree on the higher level. Essentially, 3% is probably the most you're going to be able to get out of those kind of strategies. And out of fuel economy, we're going to get 38, and there are going to be other things as well. So let's finish up with talking about more prosperous cities. The standard of living is at stake. We have a situation where in Atlanta or Dallas-Fort Worth, compared to San Francisco, you're looking at costs for housing on household budgets that are 2 to 3 times as high in San Francisco as they are in the Midwest and in the South. This costs money. You know, it doesn't matter if you move to San Francisco and you make $90,000 and you only make $55,000 in Atlanta. The fact is, the difference in the cost of living is huge and can sometimes completely eliminate any advantage. So we think about the situation we're in. The Barron's article I mentioned, the slowing to a crawl, talks about the changes in demographics in the future, which we really can't do much with, because not many people are being born that are 18 years old. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that there's declining productivity, declining labor utilization, and we have a whole bunch of young people that are getting out of school at this point with huge debts, student loan debts, They're going to have difficulty affording homes. We've got an incredible public debt and pension program problem. So we would have a big enough problem even with the demographics and the productivity and the labor utilization. But when you add these other things, we are looking at a real difficult situation. So I'm basically arguing it is time to put people first. The issue is not urban sprawl. The issue is not urban design. It is not transit versus cars. The issue is the economic well-being of people, and I am basically arguing that it is time to get the priorities right, that we need to be focusing on improving the standard of living and reducing poverty. I'd like to know who wants to argue about that. Thank you.